So welcome, friends of the White School, to these lectures on the Earth and the environment. As Janet said, this event is part of the OWL Together Homecoming and Reunion Families Weekend, but we hope it is just the first in a regular series of events that gives us an opportunity to share the excitement of scientific discovery with all of you. Discovery is at the heart of what we do in the White School. Through pioneering research, faculty and students seek discoveries with the potential to change our view of the universe and our relationship with it. Discoveries with the promise to create novel technologies to solve the world's most pressing problems and improve the human condition. Through unsurpassed education, we seek to inspire and empower the next generation of discoverers to take leadership roles in science and all of society. Our pursuits are driven by the insatiable human curiosity to answer questions that span from the microscopic world of subatomic particles to the unfathomable distances of the cosmos. Questions such as, is Earth the only home to life in the universe? Can we harness simple cellular organisms to cure diseases, detect pathogens, or increase agricultural harvests? Can we relate the properties of complex materials to the interactions between simple atomic building blocks and use this knowledge to revolutionize computation, energy, and medicine? And how do we maintain the Earth's environment while living off its resources? This last question is perhaps the most profound and pressing of our time, and it inspires our lectures today. Earth's growing population is taxing the limited natural resources on our planet and straining the capacity of our environment to absorb human impact. We also live in a period of dramatic technological advance that promises new and disruptive solutions to this challenge. Navigating this time and being responsible stewards of this one home we all share will require innovation informed by a deep understanding of the physical processes that shape our world. Today, we're fortunate to hear from 6 of Rice's most talented faculty who will each talk about different aspects of this complex topic. Each of the talks will be roughly 10 minutes long, and I will introduce each speaker just before they present. These talks will be followed by a 20-minute panel discussion during which all of you may ask questions of the panel. We will hold questions until the panel discussion, but you may submit your questions at any time through the Q&A function in the Zoom program. So let us begin. Our first speaker is Lydia Beaudrot, Assistant Professor of Biosciences. Professor Beaudrot's research addresses fundamental questions at the interface of community ecology, macroecology, and conservation biology, such as what determines the species that thrive in a given location, how global change populations and communities, and how can we use this understanding for conservation. She investigates these questions by applying advanced statistical modeling to large, complex data sets from field observations. Most of this work focuses on tropical forests, such as recent breakthroughs in our understanding of how national parks support mammal populations and overhaul ecosystem health. Before coming to Rice just a few years ago, Professor Beaudrot was a member of the Michigan Society of Fellows at the University of Michigan. Today, she'll give us a glimpse into some of the world's most critical, diverse, and threatened ecosystems and tell us about steps being taken to preserve them. Professor Beaudrot, please begin.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm sharing my slides now. And are there any concerns with being able to see them here? Looks good. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much to the Dean's Office for putting this event on, organizing it, and the invitation to speak. I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this discussion about environmental science and sustainability in our world. So, as Tom mentioned, my lab and my research program broadly looks at both basic and applied questions. So we're interested in why places like national parks have different communities of species, where community refers to different populations of species that are living together in the same place and same time, sort of very basic ecology, as well as how aspects of global change are affecting populations and communities. In particular, we're interested in things like forest conversion, land use change, habitat loss, for example, with this picture of conversion of tropical forest to palm oil plantation in the center of the photographs, and then how we can use our ecological conservation biology research for applied conservation. And the applied work has been largely in conjunction with a global monitoring network called TEAM that I'll talk about today. And TEAM uses camera traps like this one in the picture in the lower right-hand corner in forests around the world to get a sense of what's going on with animals on the ground. So today I want to talk about how national parks in the tropics are doing in terms of maintaining wildlife diversity. In the sense that I think we often like to think of national parks as these jewels, they're these wonderful places that are pristine, but we know that there are lots of people even in and around national parks, and things may or may not be as pristine as we might hope. So in that context, across the planet, we are approaching 8 billion people on Earth. Population density is highest in Europe and in Asia, but population is projected to grow globally. To give you another sense of the distribution of human impacts on Earth, we can also look at a graph of the mass or the weight in gigatons, where a gigaton is a billion tons, and look at the amount of livestock and humans that are on the planet as of 2018 in comparison with the fraction of weight in wild mammals and birds. So a stark difference here. And although population density is concentrated in Europe and Asia currently, over the next 30 years or so, and as we speak, population growth is the highest in tropical regions. So these are the areas where natural resource-based economies in many of these places subject tropical landscapes to rapid rates of land conversion, for example, from forested areas to agricultural or other human land uses. And as a consequence, the habitat loss results in the biggest wildlife losses in tropical regions compared to the rest of the world. Another major influence on wildlife in tropical regions is from illegal poaching. So even areas that are ostensibly protected on paper often have very little enforcement. And so illegal hunting is a major issue, whether it's for subsistence in certain areas or for bush meat markets elsewhere in other regions. So the problem is so severe that the phrase the empty forest syndrome has been coined, where there are forests that essentially are silent and empty because the wildlife within them has been hunted out. So against this human pressure backdrop, we know that most species live in the tropics, as is the case for the distribution of mammals globally. So here, more mammals are shown in darker coloration, showing the highest number in the tropics. And even though most species live in the tropics, we actually have a lot less data on tropical biodiversity compared to other regions. So this was a big science paper a few years back where authors compiled time series data on populations to look at their change over time. And it illustrates what I would call the tropical data void, where most ecologists are in temperate regions. And so as a function of that, we have more data from temperate regions. That was the context for the establishment of this global monitoring network that I've been working with, the Tropical Ecology Assessment and Monitoring Network. So there's been a single data collection protocol that's been used at all of these sites throughout the world, operating in 15 different countries. It's really been revolutionary in terms of the amount of effort and scope and scale of what's gone on in terms of the sampling. There are over 500 populations of mammals and birds that have been monitored, and the camera trapping data began back in 2007. To give you a sense of what happens at each of these places, there's a protected area shown here by the red boundary, and within the protected area, arrays of camera traps, which are attached to trees near the forest floor, and they're activated by the motion of an animal passing by. So we get a snapshot of where and when animals are occurring. Also, data are collected on the plants in vegetation plots and on climate from a climate station. I was brought in as a postdoc when I briefly worked for Conservation International to analyze and synthesize the camera trap data. And during our first assessment that we published in 2016, it was the first time that we had brought together these camera trap data just long enough to start getting a sense of what was going on with these large-bodied, long-lived animals. I think at that point, the longest running site had about 8 years of data. And what we found was that with a number of caveats, we were optimistic that we weren't seeing major declines over time at that time. And using this index that's been approved for global conservation efforts called the Wildlife Picture Index, whether we looked across all of the protected areas at once, or we broke them down into the individual forests, the national parks, we were not finding systematic changes. So no news is good news, but we still need to keep monitoring to see what's happening and to see if a longer time series and increased anthropogenic threats over time might support that same conclusion. I will say that things have changed a bit now with a third more data and some more sophisticated modeling. So now looking separately at birds on the left and mammals on the right, where each different line that you'll see is a separate national park, Tropical Forest National Park. What we're finding actually is that a number of these parks are showing systematic declines in wildlife over time. So the overall trend here across all parks is the solid black line. And any of the lines that are solid show an individual park with a significant decline. Otherwise, it's just the trend. So the overall line is steeper for birds than for mammals, suggesting we're seeing more severe bird declines than mammals, but that it is still the case that we are seeing declines in mammals in a number of these national parks. So this more sophisticated modeling with additional years of data for the time series are showing significant global declines even within our prized national parks. This, of course, begs the question, well, what is driving wildlife declines in these national parks? And that is something that we're working on now. So one thing that we think is probably important, but results are still pending, are the landscapes that surround these national parks. So there is a range of connectivity, forest connectivity around these parks. So starting on the left from windy impenetrable forest in Uganda, where maybe you or a friend has gone to visit the mountain gorillas, the national park is that green island in the middle. And it's surrounded by brown, which here represents non-forest cover, which is essentially a sea of agriculture. So we have parks like this all the way to, on the right, Nubali and Doki in the Republic of Congo, where the national park boundary, the protected area, is indistinguishable from the surrounding forest because it's a continuous forest. So this is one component that we think is potentially important for influencing the sustainability of the wildlife populations. We also know that illegal poaching varies at these sites. So there are some forests which are heavily protected or very far from people, and so there is very little to no poaching. To the other end of the extreme where hunters will take anything that they come across. And so all populations are subject to some level of hunting. So we are currently in the process of assessing the impacts and causes of those population declines. Other areas that we're actively working on right now, one is thinking about how species are using the parks in a spatial context. So understanding what's driving the distribution of species spatially within these national parks. And then thinking not just about the species in the parks and their taxonomic diversity, but the roles that they play ecologically in terms of their functions and the functional diversity. So in terms of the spatial distributions, what we're interested in here is essentially looking at how these species are using areas within the park, looking across the cameras, so stacking all those different species on top of each other to see a heat map of where species richness is the highest and how that is a function of the underlying habitat differences like elevation and forest cover, as well as the distance from a camera to, say, a protected area boundary or a forest edge or a road where there might be access for human to come in and dissuade animals from using that part of the park. and then to see the extent to which that varies across this landscape gradient of forest connectivity and other kinds of anthropogenic influences across national parks. I've been working with an amazing group of graduate students in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology program on this, and some of our initial results here show that we do see some major differences. So just like the birds showed bigger declines than mammals, we also see that there are more bird populations that are significantly avoiding edges relative to birds that have no preference. And we find that landscapes surrounding protected areas that are more heavily disturbed by humans have a lot more populations that are avoiding those edges as well, suggesting some human impacts on where species are spending their time within these parks. Then lastly, in terms of how well parks are maintaining the functional diversity, the function that these animals perform, my graduate student, Dan Gorzinski, has been doing some wonderful work. He looked first at one of the protected areas to see how well functional diversity is being maintained over time. And looking within Costa Rica, there was some good news a bit, in the sense that functional diversity was not changing over the 8 years of data that he looked. And in fact, when simulating the loss of species from this park and calculating functional diversity again, it looks like the mammal community in this park could actually withstand the loss of a number of species before the functional diversity that affects the ecosystem function in this park might be affected. So some good news there. But when he then went and looked across all of the protected areas around the world, he's indeed seeing some anthropogenic impacts on the level of functional diversity across these parks. So the sites that have high human density around them have significantly lower functional diversity in the mammal communities. So what I'd like to leave you with here for take-home messages is that assessing what's going on, even within our national parks, is really important in these biodiversity hotspots in tropical parts of the world. And while we did not detect systematic declines at first, the longer we have data, the more valuable they are. And we are indeed seeing some significant declines in these national parks in tropical forests. We're also seeing signs of human impacts in terms of where wildlife is occurring spatially within the parks and on the amount of functional diversity in these parks. And I think this highlights that continued monitoring is incredibly important, as well as active conservation management interventions to try to reduce some of these influences. So I'd like to acknowledge that this work was done by lots of people with blood, sweat, and tears to collect the data from a number of different organizations. And thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lydia, for that fascinating glimpse into national parks around the world. Our next speaker is Jim Tour, the TT and W.F. Chao Chair in Chemistry and Professor of Computer Science and of Materials Science and Nanoengineering. Professor Tour is a synthetic organic chemist whose research spans a vast array of topics, including many that are critical to sustainability, such as nanoelectronics, environmentally friendly oil and gas extraction, graphene photovoltaics, advanced batteries, CO2 capture, and hydrogen production and storage. He's widely known for his synthesis of single molecule nanomachines, such as molecular motors and nanocars and nanomachines that can drill through cell membranes. He's also developed quite a suite of highly successful outreach tools to bring the excitement of chemistry to K-12 students, including NanoKids, Sci-Rave, and packages for Dance Revolution and Guitar Hero video games. Sci-Rave alone has had over 1 million student downloads. Among his many honors, Professor Tour is a member of the National Academy of Inventors, a fellow of numerous professional societies, and was named Scientist of the Year by R&D magazine in 2013. Today, he will tell us about the development of advanced materials for energy, environment, and sustainability. Professor Tour, please begin.
Thank you. So today I'm going to focus on our work on flash graphene and what that can mean for the environment. So graphene is a compound, it's single atomic sheets of graphite, and it's slated to go across many applications from batteries to new materials for surfaces, lightweight materials. Right now, it's produced in bulk by taking graphite and chopping it up, and you generally get very little individual sheets. You get more stacked materials, and the cost is $60,000 to $200,000 per ton, which is really quite high. Um, what we found is we can take any carbon source and we put it between two electrodes, and we apply a high voltage and a high current, and it will break every carbon-carbon bond in the system within about just 2 or 3 milliseconds. It will heat to over 3,000 Kelvin, which is about 2,800 degrees centigrade in much less than 1 second. And then the bonds reconstruct as the thermodynamically most stable system, which is graphene. It gives a bright flash, so all the excess energy comes out as light. The outer compartment here hardly gets hot at all. It's only warm to the touch because all the material, all the energy is concentrated within. So graphene is what are the advantages? It's non-toxic. It's even used in several medical applications. It's naturally occurring in the environment, and its agglomerates are the natural mineral graphite. It's a terminal natural sink for carbon, since microbial decomposition is on the order of hundreds of years, if at all. So it never enters the CO2 carbon cycle again. It can be used in composites of all types to strengthen it. The process uses no solvents, no water, no purification necessary. The electrical flashing cost is, we estimate it to be about $35 per metric ton of coal to convert graphene to make it into graphene, or we can use any other carbon source, as you'll see today. It runs about $35 per metric ton. So the current price is $60,000 to $200,000 a ton. So that's going to make a lot of room for upcycling. Just to put this in perspective, a ton of high-density polyethylene plastic is about $2,000 a ton. So this is very expensive for a ton of material. There's a huge problem with discarded human waste material. Food, 30 to 40% of all food in the world is thrown out. It has to be because it goes bad. It forms not just CO2 in the environment, it also forms methane. Rubber tires, the US handles these fairly well, the rest of the world doesn't. Plastic is a huge problem. Right now, there's a big plastic vortex in the Pacific that's larger than the state of Texas, 10 feet deep. And we know where that comes from. Things have a way of lasting a long time in the environment. A plastic water bottle will last 450 years in the ocean. So these things last a long time. It's a big problem. This is the mismanaged plastic waste. The US is not too bad. It's a huge problem in Asia. And this ends up going in rivers, it goes into the waterways, ends up in the ocean, and makes that big plastic waste problem in the ocean. The other thing about plastic waste, it's not just unsightly. There's plastic leachates. As these plastics fall apart, these leachates come out and they inhibit the growth of these bacteria that are in the ocean that will convert CO2 to oxygen, and they reverse it, where they start taking oxygen and making it into CO2. That's a real problem for human beings. So we have found that we can take all sorts of food, we can take plastic. These are all the typical types of plastic that you'll be confronted with, and we can convert it into beautiful graphene in less than a second. We can even take mixtures. The reason why recycling of plastic just doesn't work is because you lose money on recycling. Virgin plastic is cheaper than recycled plastic because it has to be manually separated by hand. It has to be extensively washed. We need no separations, no washing, just flash it all. This is going to go into concretes. We've already worked with concrete companies, asphalt companies, going to go into paints, composite wood, steel, aluminum, even medical composites. This is, we started a company both here in Houston and in Canada called Universal Matter, which is going to be moving this into many applications. And you say, well, isn't this bad? What's going to happen? It's going to be there forever. You can just take that material and reflash it and make fresh graphene out of it. Where's energy going to come from in 20 years from now? Well, right now, what we do is we take, for example, natural gas, we combust it with oxygen, make CO2 and water. That's 800 kilojoules per mole of energy comes out. What we might be able to do is just take methane and strip off the carbons and get carbon solid and hydrogen. This process was developed in the 1950s. It's called furnace black. It's about 90% efficient. They just didn't know what to do with all that carbon solid. You can take that hydrogen, you can put it into a fuel cell, and the energy, the overall energy for these two steps is 400 kilojoules per mole, so half the amount of energy out, but it has no CO2 emission. The problem was, what are you going to do with all that carbon? Well, if you're putting out 30 billion tons of CO2 is emitted each year through combustion, what are you going to do with 8 billion tons of carbon? Because you chop out the two oxygens, you have 8 billion tons of carbon. Well, of course, we want to use that for flash graphene and then use the hydrogen in vehicles. Well, where could you put those 8 billion tons or 8,000 million tons of carbon? You could put it immediately into concrete. We have shown that we get tremendous strengthening of concrete by adding graphene. Already, you can put 8,000 million tons in 44,000 million tons. And concrete production is 8% of all CO2 emissions in the world comes from concrete production. So if you can cut down the amount of concrete, to give you the numbers, we put less than 1% of graphene into concrete, and we increase the compression modulus by 30%, and we increase the tensile strength by 20%. So think about using 25 to 30% less concrete, the amount of CO2 emissions that you save. So you save in CO2 from the use of the graphene, you save in CO2 from the change in the CO2 emissions. So this can overall have a huge effect. So what we envision is taking, and here's the group of people that have done it, but what we envision doing is taking large amounts of carbon, so from food companies that have to displace a huge amount get rid of a huge amount of food waste, plastics of all kinds, taking that and just converting it into graphene at about $35 a ton in electricity costs, and scaling that up and putting it into all sorts of materials. This process was developed by Dewey Long in my group, first discovered in 2018 and just rocketing right now. And then several other people in the group have participated in getting this pushed out there and doing these sort of things. So with that, I'm going to end and just turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. It's fascinating. Our next speaker is Sylvia Dee, Assistant Professor of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences. Professor Dee is a climate scientist specializing in atmospheric modeling, water isotope physics, and paleoclimate data model comparison. Using measurements of water isotope ratios from modern-day satellite observations and from high-resolution analysis of ice cores, tree rings, and corals dating to the last glacial maximum, she tests our ability to model the past in order to improve our ability to predict Earth's future climate. The unique insights gained from this approach have allowed Professor Dee to establish the connection between climate disasters, like Mississippi River floods, and global climate patterns, like the El Nino Southern Oscillation. She has developed a suite of powerful open-source computational tools to address challenges arising from the fact that our information on climate during the geological past is incomplete and derived from proxy data like isotope concentrations. Before coming to Rice in 2018, Professor Dee held postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics and at Brown University. Today, she will teach us about the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events. Please begin, Dr. Dee.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks again for the invitation to speak to you all today. So as Thomas mentioned, I'm going to talk about my research on how climate change is affecting the statistics of extreme weather events. And to understand this, we obviously have to back up to the physics of climate change itself. We know that the atmosphere, Earth's atmosphere, has been in very delicate balance for several million years in a relatively cool period of Earth's past. And right now, we're fundamentally altering the chemistry of Earth's atmosphere by changing concentrations of greenhouse gases. So planetary energy balance tells us that we receive shortwave radiation from the sun and we emit long-wave radiation back to space. Greenhouse gases such as methane and CO2 that Jim just mentioned trap outgoing long-wave radiation in our atmosphere essentially making our atmospheric blanket thicker and retaining more heat, which is then re-radiated back to the surface. The impacts of climate change are clearly visible in the historic climate record. So weather station measurements, for example, show us that every year since 1850, mapped here, we can see a steady trend towards warming of the Earth's atmosphere and land surfaces. So each of these rows represents a different decade. And you can clearly see that the three last decades, starting in the late 1990s, have been much hotter than every subsequent decade in instrumental history. And these changes in Earth's atmospheric temperature have direct impacts on the hydrological cycle, and in particular, extreme precipitation events. This figure from NOAA shows the number of water-related billion-dollar events. So, for example, from 1980 to 2015, we see a steady increase in the number of water-related natural disasters, and the cost of these disasters is also increasing. This is not surprising. We know that climate change will warm up the atmosphere, thus increasing the storage capacity of water vapor in the atmosphere. Basic thermodynamics tells us that a hotter atmosphere can store more water vapor. And indeed, the projected change in precipitation falling in the top 1% of flooding events is likely to increase by 40% by the end of the 21st century. Importantly, we're already seeing these impacts of climate change on the hydrological cycle. They are upon us literally right now, this week. This is a little GIF showing Hurricane Delta barreling towards the Gulf Coast. We've somehow missed 3 hurricanes in a row. As I speak, Hurricane Zeta is pummeling the Yucatan Peninsula. And in the era of man-made climate change, these sort of biblical storm events are becoming much more frequent. Honestly, in Houston, I don't need to convince this audience, we're no stranger to disasters such as Hurricane Harvey, which flooded the intersection of Memorial and Shepherd, and indeed much of the city of Houston. I'm not really sure why this gentleman kayaking is smiling, because this disaster cost the city of Houston $125 billion and counting. And furthermore, we also know that the other extreme of climate change events, in particular high temperatures, are likely to increase. So this map on the left shows projected late 21st century temperatures, and in particular the number of days over 100 degrees and the change in those numbers of days. The upshot here is that by the end of the century, we expect that areas of Texas will have between 1 to 3 months of additional days over 100 degrees, which calls into question our entire state's habitability. The impacts of these large temperature swings obviously influence things like droughts and wildfires. So, given these stark impacts, we obviously want to know how much worse are these disasters going to become. But answering this question is not trivial, because unlike some of our colleagues in chemistry and biology, for example, we don't have an experimental Earth that we can place in a test tube to do these experiments. So what we do is we build climate models, which are essentially advanced representations of the physics of the climate system. We run these models into the future to try to get a handle on how the dynamics of hydrological cycle changes will proceed into the next century. And these climate models provide the only means for projecting future climate changes on Earth. Essentially, we resolve little grid boxes in every area of the atmosphere and the ocean, and we run them forward in time. Unsurprisingly, looking into the 21st century, climate models predict warming. We can force them with varying emissions scenarios where we talk about, well, okay, so say we curb our emissions substantially by 2050, what will temperature look like by 2100? So each one of these colored lines in this graph shows the temperature anomaly that we can expect by the end of the century, depending on what choices we make in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And these temperature changes range from 4.5 degrees, which would be the high end of the projections, down to about 1.5 degrees, which is if we really get our act together. So this motivates me to ask a few key questions. We have these model simulations. We know what's going to happen to the atmosphere. I'm particularly interested in the impact of warming on extreme precipitation and flooding events in the United States. The other thing that I think about a lot as a climate dynamicist is how do we partition what the climate system is doing on its own, or modes of natural climate variability, versus anthropogenic or human-induced warming, because both are at any given time impacting what our weather and climate look like. I wanted to show you a quick case study about what my lab is working on now, which deals with the Mississippi River Basin, which we know has experienced very large floods over the last decade or so. And these floods on the Mississippi have caused catastrophic damage in particular, and we're motivated to try to understand the climate mechanisms driving these floods at a much higher level. This is an aerial or satellite photo from Landsat, one of the NASA satellites of the lower Mississippi Delta in October 2010 compared to May 2011, when once again there were large floods on the Mississippi. And we know that there are modes of natural climate change that act to amplify these floods in the US Southeast. And they cause some floods to be bigger than others. One such natural modulator is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with El Nino and La Nina events, during El Nino, the tropical Pacific Ocean warms up by about 2 degrees. And this fundamentally alters atmospheric circulation such that there's enhanced precipitation over the central United States. So El Nino events tend to prime the Mississippi Basin for catastrophic flooding events. And in climate model simulations, we can show that indeed a probability density plot of peak annual discharge over the Mississippi Basin shows a large shift towards larger discharge on the river compared to other years where an El Nino event is not occurring. And again, this is a mode of natural climate variability. And essentially, we can see that El Nino makes floods worse. And if you're familiar with recurrence intervals in civil engineering, the 200-year flood becomes the 20-year flood during El Nino events. So this begs the question, can we actually lend some prediction power to these catastrophic flooding events? And sure enough, these 2019 floods, okay, this is from a weather map showing the minor, moderate, and major flood stages on the Missouri and Mississippi in 2019. If we look to the tropical Pacific preceding this flooding event, sure enough, we see that in the central tropical Pacific, temperatures were increasing and we were entering an El Nino event. So these conditions developed several months ahead of this springtime flooding event, which likely increased the risk of flooding. So the question is, had the Army Corps, for example, known about this enhanced probability for flooding conditions, could they have prepared and adapted better? So my argument here is that we can and should be using climate variability information for flood hazard prediction. Importantly, what humans do, anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, will compound or be combined with modes of natural variability. And so one of the things that we don't know right now is how El Nino events will respond to a changing climate. You can imagine that if El Nino events get stronger and we're warming up the atmosphere, we might be setting ourselves up for getting hit double in terms of a climate change flooding scenario. We know that anthropogenic warming will affect the total moisture content of the atmosphere. This is predictable. But what we don't know are how greenhouse gas emissions are going to interfere with our modes of natural climate variability. So you can think about it using a simple schematic. Say we have a steady linear forcing on an internal oscillator in the climate system. There are many things that could happen. One is potentially this red line where we get more intense events. It could become more variable in general. And it's critical that we figure this out, and this question is not answered. So this brings me to the end of my talk, which is, I think that unfortunately these floods on the Mississippi River are our new normal. Most experts agree that the 2019 floods were the most damaging that the region has experienced in over 25 years, and these floods bear only passing resemblance to floods of the distant past. So in ongoing work with my students and postdocs from other members of the Earth Science Department, we're looking at projections of future Mississippi flooding hazard from climate models. And importantly, climate models do not agree on whether or not discharge will increase or decrease. And this is because there are critical thresholds over which extreme rainfall could basically exceed the increased evaporation over the basin we expect from heating. If we look at climate model projections for discharge on the Mississippi through 2100, I'll just direct your attention to this purple probability density function. by the end of the 21st century, we see much more elevated discharge curves as predicted by climate models. And then this bottom left plot here shows peak discharge, assuming some of those different climate emission scenarios I introduced earlier. The blue line represents an emission scenario where, again, we get our act together and curb CO2 pollution. The red line is our business as usual, we do nothing and expect about 4.5 degrees of temperature change on average. The Mississippi infrastructure, their flooding system, is designed to handle floods to about this point here. So in 2050, if climate model projections are correct, we're already exceeding the maximum flood capacity of the existing infrastructure. And I'll ask you, how many years do you think it would take to rebuild the entire flooding infrastructure of the Mississippi River? I do not doubt it will be more than 20 to 30 years. So the bottom line is that climate projections show that mitigation of carbon emissions could mean the difference between catastrophic infrastructure failure and flood control. That's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to my research, and I'm more than happy to take your questions later. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Our next lecture will be a team presentation by Professor Maarten de Hoop, the Simon Chair in Computational and Applied Mathematics, and a Professor of Mathematics and Earth, Environmental and Planetary Sciences, and Anthony Várilly-Alvarado, Professor of Mathematics. Professor de Hoop specializes in mathematical analysis of inverse problems and deep learning. The techniques he has developed help him to extract hidden signals from vast data sets, which is becoming more important every day with advances in data acquisition by dense arrays and sensor technology. An important problem that he focused on is the ability to generate maps of highly heterogeneous geological structures from scattered seismic waves. Professor de Hoop is a fellow of the Institute of Physics and recipient of the J. Clarence Karcher Award of the Society of Exploration Geophysicists. Professor Várilly-Alvarado's research interests lie at the interface of algebraic geometry and number theory. He studies the fundamental arithmetic properties of solutions to systems of polynomial equations in several variables, especially equations whose solutions represent geometric objects in four-dimensional spaces. Professor Várilly-Alvarado is a faculty fellow at Rice's Center for Teaching Excellence and recipient of numerous George R. Brown Awards for superior teaching. Today, Professors de Hoop and Várilly-Alvarado will talk about measurements of elastic properties of materials in Earth's deep interior and fault zones. Please begin.
Great, Tom, thank you for the introduction. And again, it's a great pleasure to be here. Well, we are mathematicians. We're not going to show theorems here today, but we'll talk a little bit eventually how unlikely it might sound that algebraic geometry helps us to turn the Earth inside out. So how can we actually say what is inside the Earth by using quite abstract mathematical techniques? So in short, introduction, the Earth, depending on what timescale you look at the Earth, is largely consisting of elastic materials, well, excluding the outer core. And for decades, people have been interested in determining the material properties of these elastic materials, which has been a daunting task. Now, elastic materials are typically anisotropic, which is generally viewed as a complication, but will hopefully convince you that it is also a blessing. So anisotropic materials are materials that if you probe them, say with a wave, and you rotate the material, even if it's completely homogeneous, the wave will behave differently, will interact with it differently when you vary the angle. And so how that can happen in the shallow subsurface in sedimentary basins, it can happen due to microstructures, like for example in shales. This plays a big role in studying CO2 sequestration. It can happen just in minerals, or well, in composites of minerals. Looking into the deep earth, there's plenty of olivine in the earth mantle and deeper part of the earth. but it can also be an effective property due to dynamics, for example, in subduction processes, where flow induces lattice-preferred orientations and hence causes anisotropy. Now, indeed, still today, people have not succeeded to controversially recover these properties all the way from the inner core to the much shallower crust, for example, in the vicinity of fault zones. And so mathematics can help to shed light under what conditions we can and facilitate how to do that. To give a quick idea what the complication is, there are a few, and the first one is modern day observations. We have a wealth of data around the Earth. Here you see, well, the typically available global network of seismic stations, where if we use seismic waves, we could also use ambient noise or other signals, but if we use seismic waves from earthquakes, we can be detected. At the bottom, I depict US Array. This is a project that has run for more than a decade over the United States, putting sensors on a regular grid as indicated by the dots. But then, of course, in the modern day, and I'll invite you if you haven't done so, download the MyShake app, and your cell phone can become a seismometer that we happily use in networks around the world. And here you see lit up, this was a couple of years ago, the density of cell phone users that made their phones available when they were not moving as seismometers. And this is actually a Los Angeles layout of a very dense network. So we have seemingly tremendously amounts of data to do this and work with. And we have indeed also extreme scale computing facilities available today. However, as you can see from this picture, there are huge gaps where we have no data at all, in particular the oceans, but also, for example, in parts of Africa. And so the question is, how could you go about still recovering such a complicated piece of information all the way to the center of the Earth? And I'd like to highlight that nowadays acquisition of data is very sophisticated. Here I show my collaborators in Munich that designed an instrument with ring lasers to actually not just detect the displacement, but even detect rotational motions of earthquake. You see a person going down in this facility, this tetrahedral facility, based on ring laser technologies. We also have active sources that have been developed in industry to create very low frequency waves, so we can go in a marine environment and actually generate data and observe data as well. Nonetheless, that is not sufficient to solve the issue of having fundamental data gaps. And so I would like to, on a very high level, say a little bit what is happening here and why algebraic geometry can come to help. So think of the following, that I have an anisotropic material and I study the propagation of waves such a material. There are many parameters involved, but these can be translated into a surface that is related to polynomials, intrinsically related. And you see that there are seemingly three sheets of surfaces in here. Think of it as a section of a three-dimensional surface. And what you see, they have particular shapes. And at the same time, they're entangled in one another. And that entanglement is actually what's coming to our aid. So bear that in mind. If I somehow make a dual picture of that describes how waves propagate. So if I would initiate a wave at the center, then the wavefront would evolve according to these particular fronts. Now I plotted three fronts because there are actually three modes of polarization of elastic waves and elastic material that indeed propagate in the Earth. And here on the right, you see a picture of a wavefront. Now, what you can see is that if you look at earthquakes in a particular time scale or frequency band, energy remains very localized. So waves start to behave in some way as optical rays, or more like packets of waves that are very concentrated along rays. And here at the bottom, I show after an earthquake happens, what kind of rays in a very simple Earth model are generated. These are compressional waves, the fastest waves, that bend and refract through the outer core back to the surface and even hit the inner core. And what you see here on the top is, roughly speaking, the family of waves that propagate fast. And at the bottom, you see the rays that propagate slow, compressional and shear, roughly speaking. In fact, there are three polarizations and the picture is more complicated than that. Now, what you can also remember from before is that we have particular corridors in which we can make good observations, and in particular corridors where we can just use P waves alone to do these observations. And now comes a remarkable fact that can actually be enough to do a global reconstruction of material parameters throughout the planet because of very peculiar properties where wave equations, differential equations, geometry, differential geometry to solve this problem, to recover what is going on inside the Earth, algebraic geometry comes to aid to actually deal with just these few corridors of observations to do a complete recovery of the anisotropic elastic materials. And here I hand it over to Tony.
Thank you, Maarten. And so I will show you a little bit of math, in fact. This will be a little bit different from what you've seen. And I just want to give a high overview idea of how it is that we're able to reconstruct these surfaces that are necessary to understand sort of materials in the Earth from sort of fragmented observations. And so I've put on a parabola that I hope is the sort of thing that you will remember from middle school, but I left sort of two of the numbers, A and B, unknown. And so the kind of thing that we do is, well, it's really quite simple. We make observations in the parabola and we sort of sample the parabola a little bit. And we use those observations to reconstruct what that A and B are. And so in here, you can see that if I take my X to be 3 and my Y to be 14, well, I get some equation in A and B. The same thing happens if I take my X to be -2 and my Y to be 4, and I get some equation in A and B. If you have enough of these things, you get two equations and two variables, and you can just solve. And in this case, it so happens that A is 1 and B is 2, and so you can reconstruct this curve out of sampling data. And this is the sort of thing that we want to do. I mean, this is a very small toy model, but the point is that we have a polynomial. We know the shape of the polynomial. We know what the coefficients are supposed to look like. And with some sampling, we can actually reconstruct things. But things can go very wrong in the kind of setting that we have. And here's the picture that I want you to keep in mind. There are two pictures there. And you see sort of, a circle and some ellipse. And these things can actually be modeled by polynomials. I'll put them up so you can see the general shape. It's going to be ugly. Sorry about that. So the polynomial on the left-hand side defines the shape that you see on the left-hand side, and the polynomial on the right-hand side does the same thing on the right-hand side. And the feature that these polynomials have is that they factor. And so these are color-coded, so you can see what factors correspond to what. So for example, x squared plus y squared, sorry, let me just go back, x squared, whoops, yeah, here we go. X squared plus y squared equals 1 is a circle, and that's the circle that we see here. And that's the same circle that we see there. And so here's the issue. The issue is that if you're trying to reconstruct the geometric shape that's defined by some polynomial, and you're trying to do it by sampling, and all your samples come from one piece of the geometric object that you're looking at, you can't reconstruct it. Because here are two different polynomials, right, that will have the same sample, points shown here, and I just won't be able to use that data to accurately reconstruct the original shape. And so what we do is, this is very sad. We use algebraic geometry and the anisotropy that Maarten was talking about, that is usually a defect, but is now in fact a great tool to show that essentially in the Earth, the chance that this sort of factoring of the surface and the breaking up of pieces of the surface into lots of chunks can only happen with vanishingly small probability. And so you really do not expect it to happen. And what that really says is that you should be able to reconstruct a lot of data from very few sort of samples of your polynomials. And this is really a great event. I have to tell you, I have been doing mathematics for a very long time, I do very abstract things. The ideas involved here involve proper morphisms, faithfully flat base change. I mean, there's all kinds of super technical algebraic geometry that goes into this, and I never would have thought that the kinds of ideas involved in abstract algebraic geometry could actually sort of help probe the Earth. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much on that introduction to how advanced math can be used to probe the interior of the Earth. Our final speaker today is Patricia Reiff, Professor of Physics and Astronomy and the Associate Director of Outreach Programs for the Rice Space Institute. Professor Reiff is a world leader in space plasma physics, with interests in the Earth's magnetosphere, the solar wind, and space weather. She's been a key player in numerous NASA satellite missions studying near-Earth space plasmas, including the Dynamics Explorer, Polar, Image, Cluster 2, and the Magnetospheric Multiscale missions. She's a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and recipient of multiple Professional Society awards for her path-breaking research and outreach efforts. Her Space Update and Earth Update software has been used by well over 1 million visitors at over 15 museums and has been distributed to 250,000 educators and learners. Her Discovery Dome portable planetarium systems teach Earth and space science in over 165 sites in 28 countries and 31 states. Professor Reiff frequently appears as a science commentator on local and national television and leads solar eclipse tours. Today, Professor Reiff will present Space Weather. Is the big one coming? Professor Reiff, please begin.
Hey, thanks very much. It's fun to be here, and always great to be here for Alumni Weekend because I am an alum. I got my master's here in 74 and my PhD in 75. So I love coming back for reunions. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk about space weather. And we've been talking about Earth observations, and space weather is not tropospheric weather seen from space, as this picture of Hurricane Ike, and it's not weather on other planets, but instead it's how changes on the sun, particularly grand giant eruptions called coronal mass ejections, which result from solar flares, can erupt into space, travel through the solar wind, and impact the Earth. And when they do, they can cause a significant amount of disruptions. Well, so what can happen during a major solar disruption? Some of you may have been watching this show from BBC called Cobra, and the whole storyline is that there was a major solar storm as the plot device, and it caused major disruptions in their lives. And the answer is, how realistic? It's actually pretty good. I'm surprised. The science is actually quite good. But the consequences are clearly worst case, but what would you expect from a disaster movie? So Cobra is named because it's the UK Committee for Disasters, named for the Cabinet Office Building Briefing Room A, where most of the action happens. And in the first briefing, the scientist, who's this guy down here, and the disaster coordinator, who's this guy here, warned the committee that there's a big sunspot group that they're worried about that might cause a giant flare. Well, and they say that what could happen? You could get a giant solar flare, and that would be a Carrington level event. And I'm going to explain what that is. That could cause both stage 1, prompt effects from the energetic particles, and stage 2, delayed effects from the plasma launch, which would be worse if the plasma had a southward magnetic field. So far, so good. That's actually very right. So the cabinet was not particularly moved for action, but that's how it is. Well, what was the Carrington event? Well, Richard Carrington, August 28th, was observing the sun and saw a giant white light flare. And 18 hours later, there was a tremendous geomagnetic storm. People knew about geomagnetic storms. The needles on compass needles would wiggle crazily. But this one was incredibly strong. There were auroras that were seen as far south as the Caribbean. Telegraphy was impacted. People could send telegrams with no batteries, just using the electric current that was induced in those wires. And in fact, some of the telegraph offices actually burned from the electrical currents that were transmitted through the telegraphy lines. Well, so we have storms all the time, but the Carrington was clearly, a 1,000-year storm, okay? But, can a Carrington occur today? And the point is, yes, it can. And in fact, in 2012, there was a major flare and sent a huge plasma cloud away from the sun. But we were fortunate in that here's the sun, here's the Earth, and here was this plasma cloud. It went away from the Earth and ran into one of our spacecraft, Stereo A. And the effects, if that had been pointing toward Earth, would have been quite significant. And this is a YouTube link for Dan Baker's talk on the subject. So what happens is right now the sun's pretty quiet, we're at solar minimum, but when the sun gets active, you get more and more sunspots, and the bigger the sunspots are and the more complex they are, the more likely they are to flare. So if you get something like this and it's coming around the east side of the sun, if you're unlucky enough that it flares right when it's facing the Earth, then we're directly in the blast. And this was one of those, the Halloween storm of October 2003. There were in fact 2 flares in a row about 2 days apart, one from this sunspot group and one from that sunspot group. And they were really quite tremendous in their effects. So the more complex and large the sunspot, the more likely it is to flare. There's more energy wrapped up in the magnetic fields. You can think of wrapping up rubber bands in a paper airplane. So when you get one of these flares, then you get very bright visible emission from the sun, but you also get emission in other wavelengths as well: ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma ray, and also release of very energetic particles, protons and alpha particles primarily. So those are traveling nearly at the speed of light, whereas the launch of this plasma loop into space sends out particles that arrive a couple of days later. So if you have a flare at the edge of the sun, you'll see these blasting off on the side. These are coronal mass ejections, but they're not heading our way, and so they don't really do anything for us. But if they're coming toward us, then that coronal mass ejection looks like a circle that's getting larger and larger. We call it a halo CME because it looks like a halo around the sun. And there's 2 things you notice. Look at all this snow. This snow are the energetic particles from the sun hitting the camera. The camera is not designed to measure energetic particles, but it did when all of those particles hit its camera. And so this is one that's heading straight toward the Earth, and this was a fairly substantial Bastille Day storm, we call that one. Here is one, again, heading toward Earth, and you see the snow of energetic particles released from the sun. And the problem with those is those, in fact, can cause a great deal of problems. They have problems to people that might be in space outside our Earth's magnetic field, especially people on the way to the moon or Mars are not sufficiently protected by their spacecraft. So this particle blizzard then can also affect the ionosphere, causing radio blackouts. One time when Nixon went to China with one of these radio blackouts, Air Force One was out of radio contact for 2 hours over the Pacific. So these phase 1 effects can be quite significant. Okay, well, in Cobra, what they did, they said it caused the airport GPS landing pad to fail, and so a plane was diverted to England, and the failure of avionics and the lack of fuel makes a crash on a freeway, and so disaster movie 101. And in fact, they actually took an entire plane and cut it apart, which I thought was kind of cool. So phase two is the impact of the CME itself. And when that CME then hits the Earth, then that CME hits our Earth's magnetic field, which acts like a giant shield. And if the magnetic field is southward, the magnetic field of the CME interacts and obliterates the magnetic field of the Earth and causes a process we call magnetic reconnection. So we get a compression of the Earth's magnetic field. Magnetic field is put into the tail, and the really strong auroras then happen as a consequence. And the stronger the storm, the brighter the aurora, and also how farther south it goes. So like this was the one from March of 1989, where we actually saw auroras in northern Houston if you were out in the country away from the city lights. So this is one of the biggest auroras, and because the aurora went right along the U.S.-Canadian border, it led to massive blackouts in Quebec, and also in other areas. Here's the picture of the aurora as seen from the DMSP satellite, and you can see the aurora stretching across the United States. And that's where you can get these induced currents in transmission lines. So again, that's what in the show, they said, well, what can happen? And he said, well, you know, you can have a transformer failure, and transformers A aren't small, and B, we don't have a lot of spares. And is that right? Yes, it is. So this is a transformer from Massachusetts from that same event I just showed you, where the transformer basically fried and melted. And we had transformer failures in 1989 going far south as New Mexico. So the last thing that the scientist says is, you know, you really only get 30 really good minutes of warning to know whether the magnetic field of the CME is southward or northward. If it's northward, it kind of just goes around. It causes compression, but not a lot of interaction. But if it's southward, then you can really have a problem. And the answer is, yes, that's true. Only right now, when this CME passes our monitoring spacecraft at L1, can we get a really good prediction? Well, L1 is the Lagrangian point where the gravity of the sun balances the gravity of the Earth, and so a spacecraft can stay upstream and be our upstream monitor of things to come. And sure enough, in the show, then with the end of episode 1 said, yes, we're going to be in deep trouble because it's south. So these are the sort of the storyline, and in fact, again, this is true that once our monitoring spacecraft detect the CME, the storm will start in just a couple of hours and could last as much as 36 hours. But this is something that we are trying to monitor from Rice, and this is a monitor that I did with my software of an event we had in 2015. And the blue is what we predicted, and the red is what actually occurred. So you can see we're doing a pretty good job of predicting, like 3 hours in advance, how strong the event will be. This event went down to about 200 nanotesla depression in the Earth's magnetic field. For a Carrington event, which is what they're talking about, our similar predictions can go as much as 750 nanotesla. So fortunately, we're spared from most of the ravages of the environment from our magnetic field. This is called the magnetosphere that I've spent a good fraction of my life working on. And in fact, Rice has been working on magnetospheric physics for over 50 years. And from using rockets and spacecraft, these two are on the moon with Apollo, and the MMS mission that I'm working with right now is up in space, and we aren't quitting. So there's still current student using computer models, and they're also flying rockets and have been recently selected for CubeSat. So for more information, we have our own website, mms.rice.edu, for my spacecraft, and there's some free software, and you can watch our magnetism show, and here's some other good websites. So with that, I will quit.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Reiff. And thank all the speakers for fascinating talks. So now we have about 15 or 20 minutes of panel discussion where all of our attendees can ask questions of anyone on the panel. We've already had some lively conversations taking place in the question and answer columns. So please continue to post your questions there, and I will pick questions from that to ask our panelists. So here's one just on the talk we just heard. Dr. Reiff, so what shielding options are available and being considered for these types of strong events?
Well, that's a very interesting question. If you're on the ground, you don't have to worry about it. If you are in the space station, fortunately, the space station float is close enough to the equator that it generally won't hit the space station. But one of the things aircraft do is they don't fly over the poles if there's a geomagnetic storm because of the energetic particles that can hit the crew and the people. If you are actually out in space, in Apollo, there was, in fact, my very first paper was an event that happened in August '72 between two of the Apollo missions. If that mission had happened, if that flare had happened during one of the active Apollo missions, there was very likely they would have been killed either in the lunar module or in the command module because it just didn't have enough shielding. What they can do now is put a hidey hole with water bags as like a vacuum bottle and slide into a water bag because it only takes like 4 inches of water to protect yourself from the solar particles. The galactic particles are tougher though. You can't shield from them, so you really actually go at solar maximum when the solar wind pushes them out. So there's various techniques that we do to shield, but ultimately it's expensive and it's heavy.
Great, thank you. Dr. Dee, it's often said that a single climate disaster or event can't be ascribed to climate change. Can you put that statement in the context of climate models and storm predictions for a warmer world?
Sure. So I think the key thing to notice is that while it's difficult to ascribe a single meteorological or day-to-day weather event to climate change itself, it is possible to very clearly characterize that the statistics of extreme events are changing. And some of this is just physics-based. For example, if we look at hurricanes, we know that the power dissipation index, which is a measure of how severe hurricanes can become, is directly dependent on sea surface temperatures. So if you warm the ocean temperatures, you expect that the power dissipation or wind speeds and rainfall that a hurricane can put out will increase. So there's climate physics that explain these trends, and there's also the measurable shift in the statistics in both the frequency and severity of natural disasters that we can readily report back to the public. And so the tricky thing is that, like, for example, if you look at the wildfires that are happening in California right now, we know that climate change is likely to exacerbate severe thunderstorms. But a random lightning strike in a forest is very difficult statistically to pin down as due to climate change. However, that is not to say that, again, the statistics of these events aren't increasing in severity and frequency.
Great, thank you. Here's one for Dr. Chor. How soon is flash graphene likely to start making a difference in reducing plastic pollution?
Plastic waste is such a big problem that it's hard to really make a dent quickly. Just to give you sort of a timeline, we estimate that we could probably be at a one ton production in 2 years. And if you say things go really rapidly, 3 years after that, so 5 years from now, might be able to do multi-tons a day. You'd have to have a lot of units all around the world, and there'd have to be a strong program, much like what we do in the United States with rubber tires. When you buy a rubber tire, the day you buy a brand new tire, you are paying for its disposal. You pay several dollars for its disposal fee because they know it's going to end up there. And so you would do the same thing with plastic and really force it in that direction. It's becoming enough of a problem that India has now outlawed all single-use plastic. I don't know how well they're going to be able to enforce that, but it's a real problem, as you saw those numbers in Asia. we foresee that in decades, maybe a decade or two, there would be a requirement that you'd have, if you're producing multi-tons of plastic, that you have to also get rid of a lot of that plastic somehow, either recycle it or upcycle it, which is what graphene would be, to be able to do it. But it would take a huge international effort to really make a dent.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Beaudrot, could you talk a little bit about how climate change and local human activity interact as two different or perhaps reinforcing effects on local ecosystems?
Sure, absolutely. So I talked a little bit about land use and about poaching today, but I didn't touch on climate change, which is, of course, a major threat to biodiversity. So in terms of where we're seeing the biggest impacts, the warming is happening more rapidly towards the poles. And so in that sense, tropical biodiversity, especially warm-blooded tropical species like mammals and birds, are we have less evidence of major impacts at this point. Although there are some, there are a few studies that have come out in the last few years showing that there are some tropical birds that are shifting to higher elevations to track their preferred climatic ranges as temperature warms. And absolutely, there can be interactions between these different threats. So one nice example, Jedediah Brody, who's at Montana State, has done some work in Borneo showing the interactive effects of land use change and climate change on potential range distributions of tropical mammals there. And showing that the sum, the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, right? So that there is this statistical interaction where climate change has an effect and land use change is expected to have an effect. But when you put them together, you have even bigger impacts on expected distributions of tropical mammals. So that's absolutely a possibility.
Great, thank you. For Drs. De Hoop and Várilly-Alvarado, can you comment a little bit on how the advanced mathematical tools you're working on, and whether they're used by oil prospecting companies in their analysis, or are they not yet using these more advanced methods?
Well, Tony, if you allow me, I will start to give a quick comment. Yeah, the techniques we have been working on over the past years are quite a large number of them are in practice in the
Now you're back on.
Okay, good. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So the techniques we have developed over the past say short decades certainly are quite a number of them are in practice in the oil and gas industry and in exploration. But most work that we do today is more related to hazard and deep interiors. And so what we really do with mathematical ideas is that we integrate it in our program in deep learning in AI. And so it facilitates in some way to design deep neural networks that sort of have very good properties to actually apply deep networks, to apply to actual data. And so I would say the mathematics of this is the underpinning to another stage that is the modern day machine learning that then allows us to interact with the data. And that's what we're doing essentially as we speak with groups around the world. We literally have a network around the globe, including actually on Mars. We are also working with the science team of InSight on Mars. So actually generating the first catalog of seismic data of Mars events on Mars to then look in the interior of Mars. And so a lot of these things go by an intermediate stage. So the mathematics forms the backbone of these.
Great, thank you very much. And here's one for Dr. Dee. Can you explain the mechanism by which the warming of the atmosphere, which is typically associated with more moisture in the atmosphere, is associated with increasing severity and frequency of droughts?
Yes, that's a great question. It's one of my favorite questions. So the difference here is in the time scale of the response. So as we warm up the atmosphere, we also increase the evaporative potential from evaporation over land. So we can simultaneously remove water from the landscape over longer time periods. So droughts are defined by their longevity as well as their severity, whereas floods tend to be much faster in time scale. So we're talking about longer term impacts of increased evaporation when it comes to surface hydrology balance. With the extreme flooding events, we're talking about extreme precipitation that occurs on the order of hours to a couple days. And so we're basically pulling that moisture off the surface and putting it in the atmosphere. And then it's being returned to the surface in synoptic scale weather events. So the two key things there are the time scale and then essentially the fact that increasing the temperature of the atmosphere will increase its evaporative rate just by surface energy balance. There's some really good resources on Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Institute for the interactions between climate change and drought. I'm not an expert on drought, but I'll paste some links for further reading for people who are here in the chat box.
Great, thank you very much. For Dr. Beaudrot, here's a question. So your work primarily in the tropical zones, but we often hear about the how the polar regions are even more sensitive to climate change. So can you say a little bit about what's understood and what type of work is being done to understand ecosystem impact due to, I guess, both climate change and human activity in the polar regions?
Sure. So the major impacts on biodiversity that we're seeing from climate change, there's a couple of them. So one is we're seeing shifts in where species occur, so shifts in their distributions spatially. And that the general pattern that we're seeing are poleward and upward trends. So as you move to higher latitudes or to higher elevation, temperature tends to be a little bit cooler, and so species can track the climatic conditions where they are best suited. The problem at the poles is that you run out of cooler places to go if you're already at the poles. And so the impacts on those polar species and Arctic species are disproportionately high because of an inability to move to another place where they can be in their preferred climatic conditions. So that essentially leaves the options of adaptation, evolutionary adaptation, which is easier done if you have a short lifespan and lots of generation times through which that could occur. It's much harder if you're a long-lived, large-bodied animal like a polar bear on the timescales where climate is changing now. Or figure out some way to interact in different ways with the organisms of your environment or go extinct. So the spatial aspects are much more challenging in the poles for that respect. There are also major changes in the timing of events. So the phenology is the term that we use in terms of life cycle timing, migrations, when different life stages are erupting, which has major impacts on food sources. And also in the Arctic region where animals are dependent on sea ice, there's also habitat loss in that respect from melting in the Arctic. So a number of different factors in the Arctic that are challenging above and beyond the absolute degrees of warming that are happening there.
Great, thank you very much. So here's a question, perhaps that might wrap us up, and I invite multiple panelists to give some comments on it. So based on the research that's been presented here, it seems we can see a lot of the challenges that human activity is creating to our environment, and even natural events like solar events. And in cases like the possibilities of using flash graphene, even seems in that case that government action is needed to really get these changes to happen. So what kind of influence can scientists have, given the knowledge we have, on the government policies that might be needed to act on this knowledge. So anyone like to jump in on that one?
So I would say interdisciplinary research is absolutely critical. Interdisciplinary environmental research is the way to move forward in this day and age. As scientists, we have to be well versed in the areas of our expertise, but it's also critically important that we're able to communicate with social scientists, in particular, folks working in policy and economic realms, to help with the translation of the basic science to the policy world.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I would like to. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Pat. So you know, it's interesting is if you can plot out a pathway, at least in a commercial sense, for flash graphene, and it starts working in ways that starts making money, and through that it starts really scaling so that it could be useful for, you know, some national or international effort, then it could take off. Because what happens is people look at it in a lab like mine where we do nanotechnology, and they say, well, you know, you just make a kilogram a day. For us, a kilogram is a lot of material. But then when you start getting it out there and you're getting it into a production system that really has an advantage for people, you get it industrialized, and then people start looking at it, okay, this might be viable now. So at least in what I do, you almost have to prove its worth on a large scale before you can start getting, I think, the politicians really interested in this, unless they've got an enormous amount of pressure from constituents and from bodies, or if they have a banner to carry. And we're seeing that in some of them. If there's some real personal banner they want to carry, then you can get some help along the way. But it does take a lot of confluence to have that happen. Go ahead, Pat.
Well, my point was going to be that, you know, the main place that science interacts with the government is through OSTP. And there is a chief scientist, basically, in the White House. And the idea, as these things mature, then presumably they become, you know, well established, and the OSTP is the advocate for science in public policy. And we were very fortunate to have Neil Lang in that position for quite a number of years. I know because of space weather, there was a space weather commission commissioned by OSTP. We all made our presentations, and there have been some governmental changes on the way we forecast, and also in cooperation with the electrical power industry, that when a solar storm is likely, they will deliberately brown down the transmission lines so that they don't top out. And that has saved us from having a major event in the last 20 years, is that cooperation between industry, government, and science.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful, optimistic note on which to end this discussion. So I want to thank all of our speakers again, and all of the attendees at this event. We hope you found it very informative, very interesting, and hopefully you'll join us again for another such event, and tune in for other events during this OWL Together weekend. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.